Hello, and welcome to this Demos event with Danny Kruger and David Fothergill of Somerset Council and the County Councils Network to talk about social care and the social care system. So we've got a Q&A function. Please do use the Q&A. I'm just waiting before we start as attendees come through the Zoom processing machinery, which never seems to be as quick as it ought to be. So before I hand over to David and Danny, I'll just, I guess, talk a bit more vaguely about Demos, but thank you so much for joining us. Demos has done quite a lot of work over the years on social care and the social care system. We ran a commission on residential care that looked at that in particular. We've looked at the needs of disabled people, the needs of disabled veterans, and we looked at a couple of years ago, we did an in-depth piece of work looking at the experience of unpaid carers and informal carers in the system. So we've always had this view that you need to take a comprehensive view of care, that the ecosystem isn't just the stuff that's really visible to the health secretary, the care minister. It's actually the network of people around the individual who has care needs, which includes formal carers, formal care systems, but also community, neighbours, family, friends, and volunteers. And that's why we're really delighted to work with Danny on this paper, which explores the future of social care, that tries not just to think about the paid-for system, but a way of connecting together the informal and the formal care systems. So I'm just going to click on how many participants we have. So it's stopped ticking upwards, so that's a good sign that we are ready to start. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'm just going to ask David Fothergill of Somerset Council to Somerset County Council to say a few introductory remarks about what social care is looking like on the ground at the moment and why he and CCN were keen to support this paper and this piece of work with Danny.
Thanks, Polly. Thanks very much indeed. A warm welcome from myself as well, and it's good to speak to so many people about this really important topic. Many of you will know that Somerset County Council have actually been quite at the forefront of this. A couple of years ago, we were featured on 2 social care programmes, Crisis in Care on BBC Panorama, and the impact of those 2 programmes, I think, was quite profound on people. And it illustrated not only the fact that this is about older people, elderly people, it's also about learning disability as well. Social care is a really complex system, as we all know that I'm on this call, I'm sure. So I'm absolutely delighted to support this new report that's come out from Danny Kruger and Demos. Most people attending the event will be acutely aware of the question of social care reform. It's been in the balance really for decades. But I believe, and the County Council Network, the CCN, believe that change now is inevitable, not because of the pressures on the system, but mainly because COVID has changed everything. The whole parameters of the debate have come into sharp focus. And I know that Danny's been developing his ideas concurrently with our own CCN report in collaboration with Newton, which we published a fortnight ago, which looked at how we can optimise the model for delivery, drawing on the experience and best practice of delivering social care within the county family and stakeholders beyond. So our report set out a roadmap for the government, which should really to look at how it can link together social care reform. It highlighted the link between communities and delivering local services, and crucially, it was very clear in setting out the role of local authorities in how services should be delivered. So I'm delighted, therefore, that Danny has now started to tackle the other side of the conversation, which is about the funding side, which is a question, of course, that's stuck for so long. And I'm delighted that we now begin to open up that debate. And I do hope that this is a catalyst for more people to get involved in that debate and form a view on it. So for me, this report today is really important. It not only reignites this important debate, but it actually continues the debate over funding for social care fairly and sustainable going forward. And if there's anything that has proved that, it is this COVID pandemic that we've dealt with over the last 12 months. So one of the most encouraging features that we see emerging is that the white paper should be coming along in the summer. We believe that to be the case, and we believe that there's a government's clear commitment to health and care working better together, and the importance of place in terms of determined delivery. And as a county MP, Danny is acutely aware of those specific challenges which county areas face with regard to delivering social care. On that point, I think it's very clear in this report with Grain that supporting localised system of social care is really important. So for me, there's some really nutty issues here that are being brought out and put back on the table, particularly using the Polly survey as well, results. And I really do thank Danny, not only for writing this report, but it's for a commitment to improving social care in this country. It's great to have a politician of his standing leading the charge and making sure that people are talking about this. This is one of our big issues that we face, if not the biggest issue over the next 10, 15, 20 years as a society. And I'm absolutely delighted the way that Danny is leading the conversation on this. So without any more ado, I think I now hand back to Polly, or I hand to Danny.
Thanks, David. Yeah, just to introduce Danny, if you don't know him, he is not just an MP, but also a really ambitious policy thinker, and so therefore a man after my own heart. I think lots of people would, as an up-and-coming ambitious MP that everybody's talking about as sort of, you know, future ministers, would say the last thing I want to do is try and tackle social care, one of the most difficult, thorny political issues. But I think it's absolutely admirable that Danny has decided to lend his mind and ambition and thinking process to trying to unpick the complexity of social care and bringing the values of community, connection, network and family to this very difficult issue. So I'm just going to ask Danny to set out what it is that he is recommending in his paper called The Care Commitment. If you have questions for Danny arising from that, please do start posting them in the Q&A, and we will be opening up to questions after Danny has spoken.
Thank you, Polly, and David as well. And let me start by thanking Demos and the County Council Network. I mean, I'm really touched actually that you guys were interested in this proposal, because it started life with a letter that I wrote to Matt Hancock last summer, when he issued an invitation to all MPs to submit suggestions for social care reform, which obviously is a top commitment for the government and very much a plank of our manifesto that we were elected on. We've absolutely got to come forward with proposals here. So the government have been canvassing quite widely and on a deliberately cross-party basis to gather suggestions for their reform, which, as David said, is their outline proposals are due soon. And so I wrote with a letter that drew on the information I was getting from Wiltshire, where I'm an MP, from the county council there, and a whole bunch of independent care providers, as well as residents, constituents, who all basically have the same analysis of the problem, which is that social care is underfunded, poorly regulated, and crucially, rather than enabling the different players in this mixed economy of care to work together, it basically sets different parts of the system against each other, and creates sort of all sorts of perverse incentives and frankly, bad behaviours. So what I think we need to do, and I'll quickly run through the proposal here, is to make this mixed economy work. I don't propose we abandon it, and I certainly don't propose we, as it were, nationalise social care and turn it into create a national care service, which some people have suggested, and sort of mirror the model of the NHS, fully tax funded, managed ultimately from Whitehall. I think we actually need to entrench the plurality of provision and funding that we have at the moment, but make it work in a way that supports, that is fair to everybody, and that draws on the contributions that all the different players make. So I call it the care commitment because, as we see, care is currently the responsibility of, financially, it's responsibility of individuals themselves, their families, and local authorities, with some money from central government going through local authorities. and of course charities and philanthropy as well. So there's a mixed financial package that goes in, and then the provision, as we know, is also mixed. But the crucial element of the provision, which I think we need to honour and support and assist with, is the unpaid care that's given by families. And we can call that informal care, and I do, but just acknowledging that it's very far from informal, the actual care that's provided. But it's not part of the professional fund, paid for care that's provided by professionals, agencies and others. So what I think we need is to help families to do what they do already in the most amazing way, which is looking after particularly elderly people at home. We should talk as well about working age adults who also heroically supported by families and need significantly increased support from the state as well. So I call it the care commitment. That reflects what I think we should have, which is literally a document which is signed first by the individual themselves. This is the care that I want. This is the sort of care that I need, if they're able to do that. Signed by the family, making a commitment to support their loved one and to play an active role in the provision of care insofar as that's reasonable for them and possible for them. And as part of the package that I propose, if families are able to sign that care commitment, and there's no reason why anybody shouldn't be able to, that means that the family home should be, if there is one, should be exempt from any means test for funding the system. So I think we should, we've made this point in our manifesto, I think it's a good principle to exempt family homes from the means test. But that does impose an obligation, a moral obligation on the families that are going to benefit from that asset to play a full role in the provision of care to their relative. And that means probably keeping them at home for as long as it's feasible and as long as it's in the individual's interests, and bluntly not taking benefit of the protection of their asset while passing the costs and responsibility of caring for their elderly relative onto the state. So we do need to just be aware of that danger in a system which doesn't have the family home in the means test. I think we should exclude it, but I think we should make it clear there is an expectation that families will do their bit. Of course, almost all families want to do their bit. As I've said, the problem with the system is it doesn't. It creates perverse incentives. So we should be supporting those families, supporting families to support their relatives. The care commitment would obviously also be signed by the county council, or the council, the local authority, and government as well. So it's a statement by all parties that they're going to play their role. Okay, that's the sort of superficial wrapper on the thing. This document, which is non-binding. It's kind of nudging people towards the obligations which they have anyway. And then practically, what I suggest is we use the existing National Insurance Fund, which has existed for 100 years, it was the basis of our original funding for healthcare since Lloyd George, but allocate a fraction of it to social care. And that means that we can give an entitlement to everybody who needs social care. And I proposed £30,000. We're still in the early stages of this idea, had some very help from some economists, for which I'm grateful, for costing this, but I'm not saying that every, dot and comma or fraction and decimal point has been exhaustively analysed. So, but as a starter for 10, I propose £30,000 as a basic entitlement that anybody would be eligible to receive for their care. That would guarantee domiciliary care for all, and it should go some way to covering residential costs for a lot of the population as well, based on the current usage of domiciliary and residential care. Once that 30k has been used up, then, and I should emphasise that money should be flexibly used. It can't, it doesn't have to everything be signed off by the council. It's basically a budget in the hands of the family, and it should be able to be used, I think, for friends and family and other forms of social care support. It doesn't have to be all tightly prescribed to professional services only. But as I say, it's all about really helping the families that look after people. Then you've got your after that initial 30,000 has been used up, people should be able to draw down money from the National Insurance Fund based on contributions they've made in their working life. And this is about reflecting the reciprocal nature of national insurance, which is a really good principle. The contributory element is important. If you haven't been able to make NI contributions in your life, you can self-pay. Or if you don't have the assets, and I propose an asset floor of £15,000, not including the family home. So if you don't have assets, if you have assets of less than £15,000, then you'd be paid for by the local authority as currently. And if you are self-paying, once you have spent up to £100,000 of your own money, without coming down below that £15,000 floor, then the state would step in again, and the council would pay further costs. So no one would spend more than £100,000. No one would have to spend anything if they have less than £15,000. But there is this contributory element, and which I think to reflect the fact that there is inviting people to make the contributions based on their contributions over to NI over the years is a good one. So that's it in a nutshell. I'll just end with this sort of general observation that cost, we need to spend more on social care, and we need to be prepared to do that. But ultimately, if we get the system right, the changes that are made will actually reduce the call on the public purse, because we will be reinforcing the sort of work that is done by families and communities, and is done more cheaply than expensive residential care that falls on the taxpayer. But we need to really subsidise those families to support their loved ones. And the experience of Scotland is that while obviously demand for domiciliary personal care went up when they offered that for free, further down the line, it reduced demand for residential care. And if we can delay people's entry into residential care, we will find that the overall costs fall. And according to the calculations kindly done for us by Outcomes UK, if we were to delay entry into residential care by 4 months on average, the offer of free domiciliary care at home would be covered. So that shows how you can achieve economies by putting more money up front in the system, which is what we need to do. But this isn't a money-saving proposal. In fact, it's a money-spending proposal. We need to be prepared to do that. Excuse me. So that's the plan. Just emphasise, I'm not a social care policy wonk. I found this topic absolutely fascinating. Had lots of very helpful conversations, particularly in Wiltshire. I don't pretend that I have got all the answers here. Really hope that this can be a contribution to the conversation which we need to have as a country about how to organise social care. And I see loads of experts on the call today, so I'm hoping that you can help shape this proposal and improve it. Back to you, Polly.
Thanks, Danny. Question from me, and then I'll bring David in, and then turn to the questions that people have been posting. If you have more, please do post them in the Q&A section. As I said at the beginning, what really interests me about this proposal is your desire to look beyond just the formal care system to, and you're right, the word isn't perfect, but to think about how people exist in families, neighbourhoods and communities, and how you leverage that. I guess there's a controversy there, though, as well, that, the danger is you're sort of saying, oh, it's somebody else's responsibility. It's not the state's responsibility. And in fact, a kind of an anti-status movement that may put too much of the burden on families, on particularly women who are the most likely to be stopping work to care for elderly relatives. Is there a danger that this becomes kind of a reactionary proposal that just pushes people away from the labour market and says that, in fact, especially women ought to be outside of the economy doing this care stuff that they always used to do?
Well, we have to just agree what the labour market is and what the economy is, don't we? Because the first thing to say is I do not want to offload responsibility onto families. I want to support the work that families are already doing and want to do. And I want to remove the perverse incentive that makes more sense for families to put their elderly relative into a care home when neither they nor the relative want that, but because that's the only way, that's the way the system forces them. And I was literally in touch with a constituent this morning who's having to do that with her elderly mother. Well, they haven't done it, but they're under extreme pressure from the council, I'm afraid, and from the NHS to put her mum into a care home, just because of the way the money works. So we need to actually recognise that many people would prefer to look after their relative at home. On the question about the labour market, I think this is part of a general shift we need to make about the way we work and live. And yes, if we had the old model of, the only option is either a job, full-time job far from home, or staying at home and looking after your dependents, children or elderly relatives, then in a sense it would be regressive, because we'd be saying, right, you can't work, you've got to do this instead. I think we are, and the pandemic has exacerbated this in a helpful way. We are moving to a much more enlightened model of work and life, by which people are able to live and work closer to home or even from home, and to balance paid work, unpaid work, community work, family responsibilities in a more of a plural and balanced way. And I think it's not about men and women. I think we should all have the opportunity, as many of us would like to, if it added up financially, to have more caring responsibilities and to be able to play a greater role in our communities. And I would end it by saying, money as well. I think we should be, as I've said, people should be able to use this money not just to pay agency staff to come and help with domiciliary care, but to pay their friends and families themselves, if need be, to provide social care. We have a budget, and rather than saying this money has to go sort of outside the home, as it were, or outside the community to a professional, to a commercial company, or even a charity, that money could be used in the domestic economy. So I recognise the point, but it's, as I say, part of a broader shift that I think we need to undertake in our economy to create a more local, more family-focused and more sort of communitarian economy.
And some of those insights are absolutely reflected in work that is coming out from Demos in the next couple of weeks, which people should sign up to get updated around the future of remote working and the role that remote workers have played in community and volunteering over the course of the pandemic.
Polly, thank you. Can I just quickly add, actually, you're right. And I also want to acknowledge the work that you guys have done on the back of my report using your Polis methodology. I don't know if you want to quickly explain, because I mean, I was very pleased to see that people broadly want this kind of change. And if you ask people, how should the responsibilities for care be divided up? Well, it should be balanced. They don't think people should have to pay for it all themselves, but nor do they think that the state should pay for everything. And there is a strong support for the idea that care is a social responsibility as well as a statutory one, and that we should be supported to look after our loved ones more in this more sort of informal economy side. So I think there is public support for this agenda, and in a sense, government needs to catch up, I think, with this emerging model, this kind of cultural shift, which the pandemic has brought to light about the way we all want to live.
I think that brings us to the question David wanted to ask.
Thank you, Polly. So I think it's really interesting, Danny, that the majority of people on this call will fully understand everything that you're saying and completely buy into it. For most people in the country, though, they only think about social care when they need social care, and therefore, for most people, it's not one of their priorities at any point in time. So the question is, how do we raise that question and get enough traction on it, and particularly with the policymakers in Westminster? And you'll have lots of influence here, I'm sure. We've been talking about this now for 20 years, and we've been through 12 white papers, green papers. We've been through three commissions, royal commissions. But it's a problem that is just developing. I've got over 25% of my population in Somerset is over 65. That will soon go to over a third are over 65. My number of 85-year-olds is going to double in the next 10 years. It is a growing problem, but we need policymakers at Westminster to really grapple with the issue. And my question to you is, what more can we do to get your report gaining traction and really to get this to the top of the agenda? Because too often it's been allowed to slip back down again.
Thanks. Yes. I mean, I don't think there's any way the government isn't going to come forward with proposals now. It is absolutely in a sense, COVID aside, the critical domestic policy issue, and maybe housing aside as well. I mean, it was obviously pretty important to the 2017 election manifesto. That didn't work very well. It was in the 2019 election manifesto. The Prime Minister's absolutely committed to bringing forward proposals. I've been in touch with ministers over the last months about this. And number 10, they really are obviously working on plans here, which they want to come forward with. But whether they'll be bold enough and comprehensive enough, and whether they'll reflect what I'm trying to describe about this shift in the way we work and think, work and live, or whether it'll just frankly reinforce the current system with maybe a bit more money and a bit more command and control to ensure standards of care homes are maintained. That's my fear, that we don't really grasp the nettle of change. And a big obstacle to that I detect is anxiety around deadweight cost. I mean, the more support you give to families and communities, that basically the more cost you're taking on that currently is being met through people's own efforts. But I think we do need to do that. I do think we've got to bite the bullet on that one. And if we want to shift the focus away from expensive residential care, which I think we do, we will have to subsidise the work that people are already doing in their homes and communities. And I think that's okay. But I think that's one problem that we need to grapple with. And the other is the sort of the generational unfairness implied in any more money for old people, I'm afraid, because the other great priority coming out of the pandemic is young people, and who have suffered most in the sense of the effects of the lockdown, and whether at school or going into work, and they're going to be having a tough time in the years ahead. So how do we rebalance the kind of fiscal fairness between the generations, while also, what I think we need to do, putting more money into social care? So these are some of the challenges for us to grapple with. But I think the more we can all say, let's think imaginatively and let's work in a cross-party way. I don't really feel there needn't be massive politics in this. It's just difficult for any party. And I think the more we can engage Labour particularly on it, the more we'll get somewhere.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm now turning to the questions. If you see me touching the screen, it's because I'm just scrolling through the questions. A couple that are linked, one from Robert Evans and one from somebody who hasn't given their name, around this question of informal carers. Robert says, do you think that the high number of informal carers is actually a failure of the state to provide enough affordable social care? And the other question, which I think is linked, is again about this danger of putting too much burden on the family, as that perhaps being a sense of failure. What happens when the family can't cope, for example, with dementia, if somebody gets violent, or if should we be talking about somebody's family home or the home of their children? How exactly, how does that operate in the system that you are proposing, and how do you deal with those edge cases where it gets much more difficult?
I mean, Polly, you'll be familiar with this problem. I mean, there's always a difficulty in policy that to support one sort of model or option is felt to discriminate against the other one, and in a sense, that's a fair anxiety. If I were just saying, it's all down to families and let's give them a bit of help, and that's it. Well, actually, I think by supporting family and community-based care, we can ensure that those people who have to go into residential care get better treatment and get more resources for them. Because at the moment, unfortunately, we are seeing people go into residential care before they need to. That imposes a great cost on the public purse and leads to worse outcomes. So, as ever, and I think it applies across policy. I've had a lot to do with youth policy over the years. We always intervening too late and therefore very expensively. And if we were able to put some work in for whichever sort of population we're talking about, the funding and expertise would be preserved for that acute need that really does exist. And of course, there are loads of people for whom the family is just not able, that might not exist, there might not be a family, they're not able, they don't have the capacity, the resources, the space, the inclination, the relationships that can mean that they can provide that sort of care. And it's a separate sort of issue, and a part of the reforms that I think will happen naturally if we get these structures right. We need to develop models of care that provide a community and in a sense a family for people who don't have one or whose family are too far away. We need to get away from the kind of individualistic model for residential care and for more acute care needs as well. And they're really interesting models. I mean, I'm inspired by Buurtzorg from the Netherlands that is being picked up in the UK, and the Wiltshire Council is very interested in it as well. A much flatter structure, much less bureaucracy, much less command and control. Professionals working with community groups and with families to develop the right model for shared lives, which enable people to live with younger families in the community rather than going into big care homes. There are ways of, I think, providing the sort of professional care that really is needed, that more wraparound support. But that isn't. But we'll do more of that if we succeed in helping those families which are able to look after.
There's then a question about housing, which comes to again, some work that Demos, we've done work on everything. So some work that my colleague Ben Glover did on the future of housing, where we talked about how people want the physical infrastructure of care homes. So Sam Dalton has asked the question, and I'm going to scroll back down to it again, around care homes and housing with care. How can they be integrated more with the wider community? Because again, when we engage with the public, people, of course, there's some people who really want a granny annex, some people who want their loved ones in the house, some people who want to stay in their own home for as long as possible. But actually lots of people's preferred option was to have care or housing with care type facilities close by so that they could be part of a caring network or community, but without having to be necessarily in their house. Sam asked, should there be more care settings built in town centres with services and facilities or encourage social interaction and community connection? Danny, what do you think about that? And I wonder if David has views too.
Well, very quickly, absolutely. And I mean, there isn't a single model that we should just insist upon everywhere. And there's a sense that I think that, the fashions change and we swing from one model to another. But I absolutely endorse that suggestion. And I think, there is a big imperative to get housing reform right so that we get multi-generational communities that have a future. So that, for instance, that means making it easier for young families to afford a home in a place that they're going to put down roots in. And that will enable an older, more dependent population to thrive in that community too. So yes, we do need to design in these models. And I as I say, I think there's some really interesting models, particularly from Europe, that we should be actively pursuing. And if I actually get back in a way to old models and almshouses and so on, the way that we used to think about how a community would look after its elderly has quite a lot to learn from, and you see them around the place. So I'm very much in favour of that. Yes, David, what do you think?
Thank you, Danny. So I think actually you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's about providing different models of provision. And one thing is absolutely clear is that the majority of people thrive the more independence that they have. So how can we keep people living independently as long as possible and moving through those different models? And I think different things need to be available to people. And one of the great ideas is to actually bring people into communities within town centres or whatever. And I think that would be, an alternative that many people would really welcome. I sometimes reflect on the fact we've got very good friends in Spain and Southern Europe, and a lot of those countries still have this very strong family culture, whereby they do look after their older people much more closely within the families, and they seem to be part of the integral to the family. We've lost that somehow, and we need to recreate it, and we need to ensure that there is enough wraparound for people when they need it. Ultimately, care homes, yes, but let's provide lots of other options and lots of other models for them as well.
The problem with the reason we're not like Southern Europe is we have this advanced economy that has created long commutes, long working hours culture, and tiny homes. And
it's the planning system that created the tiny homes. But you're both rurally based, so you're probably more in favour of planning restrictions than radical anti-green belt.
I'm very much in favour of reforms that enable us to build more homes, but just ones that work in our sort of communities. And I think we do, we as I said, we need to develop a better way of working and living that reflects actually how people want to work and live, which is closer to home. And whether that's bigger homes, and it can mean that you can have your old mum or dad come and live with you in their last years, or the sort of community models that we're talking about. That's what we need to design in, and not just create lots more little rabbit hutch flats in the big cities that, further estrange families from each other.
And sorry, if I can just come back in on that, because I think you make a really good point. That I think that the COVID pandemic for the last year has illustrated to a lot of families just how important their elderly members are to them, and how much they've missed them, And I think, therefore, that we will see a great desire to live more closely and to have more contact, because I think people have just missed it over the last year or so. So let's see if there's a big social change coming as a result.
Thinking about housing, one of the things that you know, it was in the manifesto, so it's not surprising, you know, that you're still supportive of it, is this determination to protect the family home and the asset of the family home. And it's one of the things that Theresa May's proposal to means test the family home for domiciliary care was so pilloried as the dementia tax. But the reality is that for lots of older people, certainly for my elderly relatives, downsizing is exactly what they should do to reduce their council tax, to reduce their fuel bills, and to reduce the risks of falls, to live in an adapted, whether it's housing with care or simply just a more kind of suitable for you know, the last 15, 20 years of life housing. The problem is, if you move from a £250,000 family home, a terrace, into a £150,000 bungalow, you've got £100,000, which ought to be there to free up you to live better. The problem is now you can be charged for your care costs. So that protection of the family home creates a really perverse incentive for people to stay, not just away from residential care, but to keep as much of their wealth locked up in that family home, which is not suitable for them, and also means that their money's locked up and preventing them from being able to afford decent heating, decent living. Is there anything we can do about that, or are just British people so mad about inheritance that we have to stick with this perverse incentive?
Well, it's very well put, and yes, that is a great challenge. And you know, just echo your point. We do have you know, a problem of quite a few elderly people rattling around in large homes that could be, frankly, needed by young families. And you know, if their family could come and live with them, then great, avoid that problem. But it's not as simple as that. We need to get these houses onto the market and moving around. So yes, I recognise that. I mean, as I say, I think there's work to be done to ensure that we don't create further perverse incentives. I think the principle of preserving the family home, though, is a really important one. It is, in a sense, an absolute foundation of sort of British culture, and it has lots of really good aspects to it. So I support that manifesto commitment, and I say, I include it in my proposal as a sort of quid pro quo for signing the care commitment that you're going to look after your relative, but how to make sure that we don't end up with people staying them in order to avoid liquidating assets that then get swiped by the means test is a challenging one. I wish I could answer it better. David might have the answer.
I'm not sure I do, but representing quite a rural area, I think one of the associated problems, Polly, is that a lot of older people would like to move to smaller properties, but they'd like to stay within their communities.
Yeah.
And those properties don't exist because, again, another fault of the planning system is that we're not building in rural areas for older people. The majority of people in the village I live in, I'm afraid, are quite elderly. So we're not providing that opportunity for them to live within the same community. And I think they're both linked. It's a very complex issue, but I agree with Danny completely. There is something about helping families to protect the family asset, really.
If they have one, of course. And then, I don't know, it's one of those, you're completely right. And all of the polling work or the Citizens' Assembly comes back to that desire. And so my inability to understand it is an irrelevant and inconsequential political fact. But to inherit the family home at 70, when it's divided between you and your brother and sister, all of whom are, in fact, now coming to what is it about the family home you're not going to move in? It's not, I don't know, it's not Pemberley that needs to be handed down generation to generation. It's a terrace house that's going to sit in probate for 3 months, hasn't been repaired properly because your parents were living in poverty, and then you're going to sell it and divide up the asset. And what you're doing is inheriting £20,000 at the age of 70, not the family home in any meaningful sense. And yet you're totally right. There's this emotional link to it that perhaps it generates. I'm sort of against inheritance, but that's my own thing. Right, let's get back to other people's questions instead of mine. Oh dear, I clicked on the wrong button. So there is a question from Tom Griffiths, which is really about the politics of this, that Theresa May, who proposed a reform in social care, did that experience of 2017 just close down the space to really be honest about social care? Or do you think we really can navigate this?
No, I think it just demonstrated how important it is to get this right. And as I said earlier, I don't think there's any wriggling away from the need to come forward with proposals. And the pandemic has, very, very helpfully brought into the light of day the condition of our care sector and the plight of care workers in particular. So whereas previously it might have just been seen, frankly, largely as a challenge for over the means test, now I think we see we have a system to reform. I mean, it's true to say, my party got burnt in 2017 over a policy that wasn't well enough worked through, and which is an argument against a snap election. This time round, there is the time and the consideration being given to it. As I said, we're waiting for government to come out with some proposals. I really hope that's the beginning of a proper open public conversation about the sort of reforms we need, rather than a fait accompli. And I know that politicians from other parties will, I hope, want to engage constructively when those proposals come forward. So I think we're in a good place politically for this, and we've got a whole bunch of new MPs who are not particularly committed to any previous policies. So I think I'm feeling quite hopeful that we'll actually get something good out of this.
Right, because I was feeling a bit depressed thinking back to the Royal Commission in '97, which also promised to fix this. It's been a long time. There's another crucial question which comes in from Annie Stevenson around status. How, she asks, can we improve the status of carers and care? Is it just about pay? We've seen extraordinary service from care workers, camping on camp beds with bin bags as PPE, just to create a bubble to protect the residents of care homes, for example. And yet still so many of them on minimum wage, gig economy style contracts. How do we change that? Is it just about more money?
Well, my answer would be it is a lot about more money, and we do need to achieve some greater parity of pay. A negative consequence of the increasing NHS wages over the last few years is that we've seen a lot of people leave the care sector to go and work in healthcare, and there's a sort of recruitment. There's a recruitment problem in the care sector, and we have a poorly remunerated workforce there. Also, I mean, as the question implies, a question around status. I mean, I was very surprised and stressed to find quite often getting letters from care workers in my constituency saying they weren't prioritised in any sense for, priority shopping or other forms of support that were available to health workers during the early stages of the pandemic. So I think there is a increasing recognition, thanks to the pandemic, that care workers are vital frontline workers, and they do a job just as important and just as difficult, and often more traumatic when they're working in their relationship with people for months or years, who have then died in great numbers in the pandemic. So the trauma in the care sector must be as great as that in the NHS, where it's obviously more acute and dramatic, being on an ICU ward. So I think we've learned the value of care workers, and I would endorse the proposal for a greater regulation of the sector, which gives a sort of status to the care worker that health workers have, or teachers have, or police officers have. They'll obviously be employed locally and often privately, but some sort of badge of being a care worker with particularly if they're qualified, would be appropriate, and then we can start to put in place alternative sort of forms of support and sort of status enhancement for them. But you know, yes, we absolutely need to pay care workers better and ensure that they are part of a properly recognised and regulated workforce.
So one of the arguments for having a national care service is actually about status. You know, that Matt Hancock can wear the NHS badge and then he puts on the care badge and nobody quite knows what that is or who works in the care sector. And there is no standardised care sector badge to show at Tesco to get into the priority queue or whatever it might be. You, in your paper, make the case for maintaining the mixed economy. And we've had a question from Paul Rackham, who is a provider, a private sector organisation in Wiltshire. I'm not sure if it's in your constituency, that is involved in the sector. So why are you so committed to maintaining private and community and voluntary sector involvement and not standardising everything under a national care service?
Well, I mean, I think the NHS needs to be more like the care system at its best, rather than the care system being more like the NHS. You know, I don't think centralised systems have excelled themselves over the last year, and you know, there's obviously a vital role for national government in setting standards and ensuring fairness and resourcing work, and also taking on great strategic responsibilities and acting in a crisis, you know, when national coordination can work, as we've seen over vaccination, for instance. But in general, I think we need to be strengthening the local base of our care system. And I think there is real value in having this mixed economy of providers where we, you know, frankly can draw on assets that exist in the community that the taxpayer and the central state cannot find. You know, the fact that care homes are often, you know, run as small businesses, often family owned, often, you know, some decades old or older, is a great asset for the system. And the fact there's flexibility is really crucial. So I think the local links between councils, care providers, families and communities is one of the great strengths of the system that we have. It doesn't work at the moment because the funding sets everybody against each other, but that system is potentially very, very strong. I think we should be seeking to reinforce it rather than to centralise and standardise. I mean, on the workforce though, there would be value in properly designating care workers. I mean, you know, we need to be clear where the boundary is between this formal and informal care, and actually there's some value in it being a bit blurred. But where people are qualified, where it is their profession, where it is their vocation, and they work across the board, they're not just helping their neighbour or their own relative in a sort of so-called informal way, whether that's paid or unpaid, where they are actual professionals delivering a highly skilled and qualified service, then I think recognising that through some sort of national status and registration of care workers would be appropriate.
And I mean, just ask David why he, as a council leader, advocates for a kind of that locally based system as well. But is there a limit in your view as to the involvement of the private sector? Do you worry about venture capital involvement in the residential care sector? Are there things you think we should change, reduce or limit, or is it just a question of making sure the money flows and the regulations are in place, Danny?
Well, quickly, I mean, yeah, I do worry about the role of venture capital and big business in care. I basically think it's pretty inappropriate that we have often, you know, internationally based investors rinsing our taxpayer for profit for substandard care, to be blunt. I mean, that is, you know, where that happens, sadly it does in care and in children's services as well, it's totally not okay. So if we had the right system, the incentives for that would be lower. So at the moment, for instance, you have a problem whereby the costs that councils pay to care homes doesn't actually cover the cost of the care that's being provided, and it certainly doesn't cover the cost of any capital improvements that are needed for the care home. So if you're a small little one-man band or family business running a single care home, if you're reliant on council fees, you're not viable. So the only way to do it is to cross-subsidise from your self-funders, which is unfair on them, and you are not able to invest in your stock, your building, and you get progressively more run down, and self-help funders don't want to come, and the council doesn't pay you enough, and you go out of business, and then you get scooped up by a big firm. So we need, if we got the funding right and we paid properly, we would create an economy of local entrepreneurial social enterprises, I think of them really as, whether they're profit distributing or not, and have a better system. So I think private is good, but I don't like these big the danger of big VC funding.
David, is there anything you wanted to say about the benefits of a local model?
I think the benefits are there in terms of being very close to communities. I mean, care homes, residential care are part of our communities, and it's local authorities that understand them most. I've got total admiration for the NHS and the work that it does, but they are primarily focused on acute and hospitals. It's the community work where I think that we can have the most effect, and we've demonstrated that when public health came into local authorities, just how we could transform public health services. So keeping that care local, I think, is really important. I just want to come back to one thing as well about how we enhance the status of care workers, and I think we've got it a bit more right in recent weeks. We've put care workers in the priority groups to be vaccinated, and that's been fantastic. But in the early days, you know, they were forgotten on PPE, they were forgotten on, you know, on all sorts of fronts. And I think that we just need to make sure that somebody is centrally is picking that up, and we're getting consistent messages just how much we value care workers. That's where the status will come from. I'm afraid the money is important, and I support, you know, the move to increase that for them. But the real gain will come when they're treated as equals by people that talk about you know, the care system, the health and care system in the country. So I'd encourage everybody to make sure that they mention them as much as possible in a very positive light.
So I've got one final question from Izzy Seacombe before we draw to a close, which is about working age adults. And Danny, you mentioned them in the paper, but so much of this conversation is dominated by a discussion about the elderly, about the aging population. We know there's also, you know, in some places, half the adult social care budget is going on working age adults, and rightly so, to give them the independence, the fulfilling lives that they need. And there's also recently been discussion around people with learning disabilities, and the status of them, their lack of priority, particularly when it comes to vaccination, has been the kind of the acute point. But again, a sort of sense that people with physical or mental or learning disabilities during working age are somehow deprioritized, even though councils know about them as children and ought to be able to create a seamless transition. Izzy suggests we should separate out care for working age adults from the elderly social care system. I wonder what you guys think about that proposal, but also this wider question of how we level up care for the group of working age adults, which is growing and needs the support.
Yes,
Danny.
so as you say, this is where the big budget pressure is from. It's a much smaller population, but each person on average of working age who needs social care needs a lot more of it financially. And of course, the care is slightly different. And I mean, without generalizing too much, but generalizing, working age adults basically need help to be as independent as possible, and to live in mainstream society, to work if possible, to live, you know, in the community. Whereas often for older people, it's more about having a settled support. And yes, potentially, and I very much support these models of shared lives and so on, but they might actually want sort of more embedded relationships, basically having a quieter life. Whereas for working age people, they want the same life that other working age people have. And so there is a bit of a difference in how we conceive of the sort of care that's needed. And yes, it's a great shame, and it's a really, you know, it's an unhappy thing when you see a person in their 20s or 30s basically being often sent to the same day centre with a bunch of very elderly people, you know, or imagining that their needs are the same. So I recognise the need for really making that distinction. However, I think the same funding model applies to both. There is a bit of a difference for working age people, which is in general they don't have the assets that older people have built up, and therefore my model of ensuring that there's self-pay and or national insurance contributions is part of this. it probably doesn't apply so much for them. So actually, I imagine that for working age people in receipt of social care, it will be overwhelmingly funded through the public purse, as it is currently, and that's quite appropriate. And what I hope is that the dynamic effect of the reform that I'm proposing will be that we enable money to be saved from that later expensive residential care, particularly for older people, and that we can find more money properly for working age people. But yes, we do need to conceive of them separately, but I think a more dynamic funding settlement that enables a more responsive model for everybody means that working age people will get the right sort of model that they need.
Great. David, any thoughts on that before we draw to a close?
I think that they have to be viewed separately, and I think in practice they absolutely are. The needs of the elderly population are relatively short to medium term compared with working age adults who have got longer term issues that we need to help to fund and to deal with or to help to manage with them. So I think they are viewed separately, and I think that that they are often overlooked even within, if the social care system is overlooked, then the working age adults within that social care are even more overlooked. So it's been great, some of the conversations that have been going on recently, particularly on social media about learning disabilities as well. And I think that's right, but we do need to focus on them separately. They've got different needs, and they've got different time frames that we need to be working on. So yeah, the more that we can carve out a different approach to them is absolutely right.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Danny for coming to Demos to publish this set of proposals. Thank you to the County Councils Network for providing support. There is more work from Demos on this topic and on a range of other kind of allied issues, from housing to the way public perspectives have changed over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, coming out in the next few weeks. So we hope that you will all stay in touch with us and follow Danny as he campaigns to persuade the government to adopt this model, or certainly many of the elements of it. Danny, is there anything kind of final words you wanted to say before we wrap up?
Other than thank you, and very much appreciate all the conversation in the chat and the Q&A as well. There's some very great experts here, so appreciate all that. And please do let me know if there's anything people have to suggest and to improve my proposals or make any suggestions to government. And thank you to Demos and CCN particularly for enabling this to happen. Thanks.
Great. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. Some of them were too complicated or just too similar to one another. Anyway, thank you so much for contributing. Thank you for your thoughts, and please do stay in touch.